My mother's fingers closed around my daughter's wrist under the Christmas tablecloth, just tight enough to make Lucy go perfectly still. Candlelight flickered across the white linen, and for one suspended second nobody breathed. My father pushed back his chair with a scrape that cut through the holiday music. "Not in front of guests," Robert said, as if my 6-year-old had chosen this. My mother smiled the way she smiled at church, while her fingers stayed where they were. "This is why you should have chosen better," Margaret murmured, eyes on the stains spreading across the cloth. Across the table, my brother Daniel laughed softly. "She's always dramatic," he said. Lucy had been trying so hard all night, hands folded, voice polite, eyes bright. Then her elbow bumped the gravy boat, a simple accident, and suddenly the room turned cold. In my parents' world, mistakes were invitations for lessons, and Lucy was the easiest target because she belonged to me. I moved before my thoughts caught up. I stood, stepped forward, and placed myself between my parents and my child. My chair legs dragged against the hard wood. Lucy's wrist slipped free as my hand covered hers, warm and steady, and I guided her behind my hip. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize for her existence. I said gently, "Lucy, sweetheart, go upstairs and wait in your room." She hesitated, eyes flicking to my mother's face, and that hesitation told me everything. "Sit down, Anna," my mother said like I was 12 again. "You are embarrassing everyone," my father added, his voice low. Daniel shook his head like he felt sorry for me. Something inside me went quiet. Not calm exactly, but clear. This was not about gravy. This was about control. I saw the pattern in a flash. Every holiday where they praised Daniel for breathing and looked at me like a warning label. Every time my mother spoke about single mothers as if we were a cautionary tale. Every time my father called himself the man of the house while the mortgage statements arrived in my name. And now my daughter standing there with her shoulders tucked in, learning that love could be conditional. My name is Anna. I am 26 years old, a single mother, and the legal owner of the cedar-sided house outside Salem, Oregon. Lucy is 6. She loves cinnamon rolls and drawing dogs with wings. My father is Robert. My mother is Margaret. My brother is Daniel, 34, and still convinced respect is something other people owe him. Tonight is Christmas Eve, and my parents insisted on hosting dinner in my home, as if the deed was a rumor. They call it the family house. They say it with ownership, but their names are not on the paperwork. Mine is. I watched my mother's eyes flick toward the living room corner, toward the small camera we use for the front door. She did not realize it also caught the edge of the dining room and the way her hand had closed around Lucy's wrist. I watched my father glance at the doorway as if measuring the room for witnesses. Then I made the decision that would change everything. I did not threaten. I did not bargain. I simply took Lucy's hand and started toward the stairs. "Don't you walk away from me in my own home," my mother snapped. I paused on the bottom step and looked back at her, at the stain at the faces, waiting to see if I would fold. It was my home, but I did not say it yet because speeches turn into debates. So I kept my words small and my actions official. Lucy's small hand found my fingers and squeezed hard, like she was checking if I was still there. I felt my mother's breath change the way it always did right before she performed concern for the room. She dabbed at the tablecloth as if the stain mattered more than the child. People looked down at their plates. Someone cleared their throat. No one moved to help Lucy. That silence was its own kind of permission, and I understood then that if I did nothing, this would become Lucy's normal. I decided I would rather be judged than let her learn to accept this. Earlier that morning, while Lucy watched cartoons, I had printed something at the kitchen island and slid it into a folder in the drawer beside the silverware. I had hoped I would not need it on Christmas. But hope is not a plan, and I am a mother. In the next 60 days, everything my parents clung to, their image, their authority, the story they told about who deserved what, would start to crack piece by piece. Not because I wanted revenge, because I finally chose a line they could not step over, and I had the paper to prove it. If you have ever had to protect your child from your own family, Stay with me. What happened after that dinner did not just change Christmas, it changed the rest of our lives. A few minutes before everything went wrong, the dining room looked exactly the way my parents liked it. Controlled and spotless, the white tablecloth stretched tight across the table, candles placed at even distances, silverware aligned so precisely it felt measured rather than set. Christmas music played low from a speaker in the corner, the kind meant to sound warm without inviting conversation. My mother, Margaret, moved around the table making small adjustments. No one had asked for nudging a fork here, straightening a napkin there, as if the room itself needed discipline. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, hands folded posture, rigid, surveying the scene like a final inspection. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair phone, face down near his plate, already wearing the faint smile he used when he knew tension was coming, and it would not land on him. Lucy sat beside me, feet swinging just above the floor, her hands folded in her lap the way she had practiced back straight, eyes bright but careful. She had asked twice if she was doing okay. I had told her she was doing great. She was trying so hard, harder than any 6-year-old should have to try, watching faces, waiting for cues, learning which version of herself was safest at the table. Dinner was nearly done when it happened. Someone passed the gravy, the heavy ceramic boat warm in Lucy's hands. She reached forward the way she had been shown careful slow, and her elbow brushed the edge of the table. It was a small thing, the kind of accident that happens in any family without consequence. But the boat tipped, and a dark ribbon spilled across the white cloth, spreading quickly toward the centerpiece. The sound was soft, almost polite, but the effect was immediate. The music seemed too loud. Lucy froze. She did not cry. She did not move. Her shoulders tucked inward as if she were trying to become smaller. Margaret stood up at the same time Robert did. Their chairs scraped back in unison, the sound sharp enough to cut through the room. The space between them and Lucy vanished. Margaret's voice came first, tight and bright. "Do you see what you've done?" She said, not to Lucy, but to the table, to the guests, to the moment she felt had been ruined. "This is exactly why discipline matters." Robert's voice followed, lower, pressed flat with warning. Not in front of guests. He did not look at Lucy. He looked at me. I recognized that look immediately, the one that meant I was supposed to swallow it, apologize, smooth things over, offer my child up as proof that I understood my place. Margaret shook her head slowly, lips pursed. "You're raising her wrong," she said, still not looking at Lucy, as if speaking about her made the lesson cleaner. Lucy's eyes flicked toward me for half a second, and then dropped back to the tablecloth, to the spreading stain she seemed to believe she had become. Daniel let out a soft laugh from across the table. "She's always dramatic," he said, as if this were entertainment. The room did not rush to Lucy's defense. Plates stayed still. Glasses remained untouched. Someone cleared their throat and then stopped. In that pause, I felt something shift, a quiet certainty settling in. This was not about gravy. This was about control. I watched Margaret's hands as she reached for a napkin, the way her fingers pressed too firmly against the cloth, the way she spoke about embarrassment, as if it were a moral failing. I saw Robert angle his body, subtly blocking the space between Lucy and the rest of the room, his presence heavy, immovable. Lucy stayed frozen, hands clenched now, knuckles pale. I moved my chair back and stood. The legs dragged against the floor loud enough that a few heads turned. I stepped forward and placed myself between my parents and my child. My hand closed gently over Lucy's, warm and steady, and I guided her behind my hip. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply said, "Lucy, sweetheart, go upstairs and wait in your room." She hesitated, eyes darting to Margaret's face, and that hesitation told me everything about what she had learned to expect. "Sit down," Anna Margaret said sharply. "You're embarrassing everyone." Robert's voice dropped again, quieter but heavier. "This isn't how family handle things." The words were familiar. They had been used before when I was younger, when I had made mistakes that needed to be corrected publicly. For a moment, a memory flickered. Another table, another holiday. My own hands folded too tight in my lap, while someone explained what I owed. I recognized that look again, the look that said, "Keep the peace at your own expense." I felt Lucy's fingers squeeze mine. I turned slightly so she could slip past me and head toward the stairs. As she climbed, I glanced at the clock on the wall above the doorway. It was just past 7. The time registered without effort, like my body was already cataloging the moment. When Lucy's door closed upstairs, the sound soft but final, Margaret exhaled sharply. "You can't stop us in our own home," she called out toward the stairs. The words landed heavier than she knew. I looked at the stain again, at the careful arrangement that had mattered more than my child's breathing. I walked back to my seat, pulled out the chair, and sat down. No one spoke. The candles flickered wax pooling at their bases. I reached down to the drawer beside me, the one where we kept pens and spare napkins, and slid out my notebook, the thin ledger I used to keep track of things. I opened it and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. I did not explain why. I did not need to. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the line had already been drawn, and everyone could feel it. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed silent at that table? I bought the house between late 2021 and early 2022, when I was 23 turning 24, right after Lucy learned to sleep through the night, and I could finally think more than 1 week ahead. I did not buy luxury. I bought stability. A modest cedar-sided place outside Salem with good bones, a quiet street, and a school within walking distance. I remember standing in the empty living room the first night after closing the echo of my own footsteps. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust, and thinking that this was the first thing I had ever owned that could not be taken away by someone else's mood. My name was on the deed. The mortgage was in my name. Every bill that arrived in the mailbox had my name printed clearly at the top. When my parents first moved in, it was framed as temporary. "Just until we get back on our feet," Margaret said, standing in my kitchen with a sympathetic tilt to her head. Robert nodded along, adding that family helped family, and that it would only be for a little while. Daniel backed them up with a shrug and a grin, saying it would be good for Lucy to have grandparents around. I agreed because I believed temporary meant temporary, and because I had been raised to smooth things over to accommodate, to believe that saying no made me ungrateful. The first few weeks were quiet enough. Boxes stacked neatly in the spare room, shoes lined up by the door. But temporary has a way of stretching when no one challenges it. One morning I came home to find an extra lock installed on the back door. Margaret explained it away easily, saying she worried about safety and had taken care of it for me. The thermostat changed next, adjusted to temperatures that had nothing to do with Lucy's comfort and everything to do with Robert's preferences. Notes began appearing on the fridge about kitchen rules, about which shelves were for what, about how dishes should be stacked to avoid embarrassment when guests came over. Guests began arriving without notice: church friends, old neighbors, people I did not know sitting at my table thanking my parents for their hospitality. When I mentioned advance notice, Margaret laughed softly and said I worried too much. Robert told me I should be grateful they were helping keep the house respectable. Daniel made it a joke, asking when I had become such a landlord. The word stung because it was meant to. Bills kept coming. The mortgage draft cleared every month from my account. Property tax notices arrived twice a year, and I paid them on time. Utilities stayed in my name because that was simpler, or so I told myself. Electricity, water, internet, home insurance. Repairs when the old furnace hiccuped in winter. Groceries that filled the fridge and disappeared by morning. I could list the numbers without looking them up because I had been carrying them quietly for years. And every time I tried to bring it up, Daniel cut in with the same line: family doesn't charge family, like it was a rule carved into stone. He said it often enough that Margaret began to repeat it, her tone sweet but firm, as if money itself were a sign of moral failure. Robert would end the conversation by reminding me that respect mattered more than receipts. Slowly, the language shifted. My house became our house in conversation, then simply the family house. Decisions were made without me. Furniture was moved. The spare room became theirs. Lucy's routines were adjusted to fit their schedules. When I pushed back, I was told I was sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful. I watched entitlement take root the way mold does in a damp corner quietly at first, then spreading everywhere. The realization did not hit all at once. It came in pieces. The way Margaret spoke to Lucy about manners that only applied to her, the way Robert introduced himself as the man of the house, the way Daniel lounged on the couch criticizing how I ran a home I paid for. After the dinner, after Lucy went upstairs and the house settled into a tense quiet, I went to my laptop. I searched my email the way you search for proof you hope you will not need. It did not take long. There it was, an old message thread from years back, Margaret thanking me for letting them stay and confirming the terms we had discussed, temporary, respectful, my rules. Attached was a simple agreement we had all signed, more about expectations than rent, but clear enough to matter. I downloaded the scan and saved it where I had been quietly organizing things for months. The folder name was plain and cold, housing/2024/notices. Seeing it there did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel awake. The lie had never been that they were family. The lie was that family meant surrender. By the morning after Christmas, it was clear to me that the spill had never been the point. The language shifted back to its usual small daily cuts, the kind that left no marks but changed how you moved through a room. Margaret commented on Lucy's breakfast manners, sighing that children without fathers never learned restraint the right way. Her voice light enough to sound like concern, but sharp enough to land where it hurt. She said it while handing Lucy a napkin, as if the problem were crumbs, and not the implication behind the words. Robert followed it with his own refrain, reminding me in a low, measured tone that I owed them respect for everything they had done, for being present, for keeping order, for teaching lessons I was apparently too soft to teach myself. Daniel lounged nearby, adding his commentary, like background noise, saying Lucy was lucky they even let her keep the house calm. Lucky they stepped in when things got messy. Lucky someone was willing to correct what I missed. None of it was said loudly. That was the trick. It was all delivered in normal voices at normal volumes, wrapped in the language of family and concern. It was the kind of toxic that thrived in daylight. Guests came and went in the days that followed, people dropping by to exchange leftovers or belated gifts. Each visit became another opportunity. Margaret asked Lucy to apologize again, slowly, clearly, so everyone could hear. "Stand still," she said, hands on Lucy's shoulders, turning her like an object to face the room. "Look at people when you speak." Lucy's voice shook as she repeated the words she had already said the night before. Cheeks burning, eyes darting to me and then away. Robert nodded approvingly, telling her that lessons only worked if they were uncomfortable. Daniel smirked and told Lucy that embarrassment built character. When plates needed clearing, Margaret directed Lucy to do it alone as a reminder, calling it a lesson in responsibility. Lucy carried dishes too heavy for her small arms, hands, trembling eyes fixed on the floor. I watched all of it with my jaw tight and my hands steady, nails pressing half moons into my palms beneath the table. Every instinct told me to intervene, to scoop Lucy up and end it, but I could feel the trap in their eyes. They wanted a reaction they could label hysterical. They wanted proof that I was the problem. So I stayed quiet and watched. I noticed how Lucy changed. She spoke less. She startled when chairs scraped against the floor. She asked permission for things she had never asked about before. When someone raised their voice, even in laughter, her shoulders jumped. At night, she asked if she was bad. I told her no, over and over, until the word lost its shape. Each incident lodged itself in my chest, heavy and unmoving, and with each one my resolve hardened. This was not discipline. It was humiliation dressed up as care. It was control, practiced in small doses until it felt normal. One afternoon, I found Margaret correcting Lucy for folding laundry the wrong way, her fingers pinching fabric and skin alike as she repositioned tiny hands. Robert stood in the doorway, watching, arms crossed, saying nothing. His silence an endorsement. Daniel passed by and muttered that this was why structure mattered. I said nothing. I turned away before they could see my face. That night, after Lucy fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the house finally quiet and opened my notebook. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote what was said and who said it. I did not add commentary. I did not dramatize. I logged facts the way I would log expenses or appointments. Discipline comment. Apology demanded in front of guests. Cleaning assigned as lesson. I kept my handwriting neat. Each entry felt like placing a stone on a scale. The pattern was undeniable once it was written down. Day after day, small humiliations framed as teaching. Respect demanded without being given. Control enforced under the banner of family values. I realized then that arguing would never work. Words were their territory. They thrived on them, twisted them, used them to corner and shame. I was not going to win with words. I closed the notebook, slid it into the drawer, and turned off the kitchen light. I decided on a strategy that felt almost invisible from the outside, but solid underneath silence, paired with systems observation, paired with preparation. I stopped correcting them in the moment, because correction fed their appetite. I answered questions briefly. I did not explain myself. I did not defend my parenting. I focused on Lucy and on keeping my reactions small and contained. The colder I became, the more my parents pressed. Margaret began reminding Lucy at breakfast that children without fathers needed stronger guidance, saying it with a smile that suggested concern while her eyes stayed on me. Robert started speaking about respect again, saying it in front of Lucy as if the word were a lesson she should memorize. Daniel escalated by joking loudly about how people talked, how reputations were made and broken in small towns, how it would be a shame if misunderstandings reached the wrong ears. Margaret picked up that thread quickly. She mentioned church friends and neighbors, saying casually that people worried when families seemed divided, that stories had a way of spreading. The message was clear without being spoken outright. If I did not fall back in line, they would frame the story for me. I nodded and kept my voice neutral. Inside, I was building something they could not see. On my lunch break one day, I sat in my car and called a tenant rights clinic in Oregon. I spoke, calmly gave the facts without emotion, asked about notice requirements, non-renewal options, timelines, what documentation mattered and what did not. I did not need to cite statutes. I needed to understand process. The paralegal explained it step by step, how notice worked, how certified mail created a record, how eviction was a last step if someone refused to leave. I thanked her and took notes. Later that week, I scheduled a second call to clarify details, then another to confirm timelines. Each answer removed a layer of fear and replaced it with sequence. At home, the atmosphere thickened. Margaret began rearranging Lucy's schedule without asking. Robert commented on my work hours as if they were a flaw. Daniel left doors open and lights on and then complained about bills. I did not argue. I watched. I wrote dates and times. I saved messages. I kept screenshots. When Lucy asked why Grandma sounded angry, I told her adults sometimes confuse control with care and that none of it was her fault. I printed the notice on a quiet morning when the house was empty, the printer humming steadily at the kitchen island. I read it twice, then a third time, checking names and dates, keeping the language simple and factual. I placed it in an envelope and added it to the folder I had been building. I booked a notary appointment and marked it on my calendar. I prepared the certified mail label and set it aside. I did not rush because rushing creates mistakes. In the back of my mind, there was a steady reassurance I did not share with anyone that I had already set aside money for exactly this moment. A cushion built quietly over time for emergencies and transitions, enough to absorb delays and keep Lucy stable, no matter how loud things became. When the papers were ready, I stood at the counter for a moment, with my hand on the envelope and felt the weight of what came next. Then I slid it into the folder and closed it. Stay, because this is where the story stops being emotional and starts being official. I gave them the notice on a Tuesday morning, because Tuesdays were ordinary, and I wanted this to be ordinary, a process, not a scene. Lucy was upstairs coloring in her room, the door partly closed, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and toasted bread. My parents were at the table the way they always were. Robert reading headlines on his phone. Margaret folding a dish towel as if she had nowhere else to be. Daniel lingering near the counter, pretending he was only passing through. I placed the envelope on the table between Robert and Margaret, and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Margaret looked down first. Her eyes moved across the page, then back up to my face, as if she expected me to laugh and say it was a joke. "What is this?" she asked, voice too light. "It is notice," I said. I kept my tone even. "The arrangement is ending. You have 60 days. Robert let out a short sound that was half laugh and half scoff. "You would not," he said, and he smiled like he had just called my bluff. The smile did not reach his eyes. Margaret read the first line again, slower this time, then pressed her lips together. "You cannot do this to your own parents," she said, and there was the first hint of anger under her performance. Daniel picked up the paper, skimmed it, and tossed it back onto the table as if it were trash. "This is insane," he said. "Family does not do this. You do not charge family." I did not argue with him because arguing is what he wanted. I simply pointed at the dateline. "The clock is already running?" I said. Robert leaned back in his chair and folded his arms jaw set. "You would not put your mother out in winter?" he said, then he shook his head like he was disappointed in me. Margaret's eyes filled suddenly, perfectly timed, because that was when the back door opened, and one of my aunts stepped in with a tin of cookies and a cheerful greeting that died in her throat. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, tears spilling over as if she had been wounded. "Anna is doing something terrible," she said, voice breaking, and she turned her face just enough so my aunt could see the shine. Robert stayed quiet, letting her tears speak for him. Daniel made a noise under his breath and pushed his chair back hard. The legs scraped the floor, and the sound made the coffee cups rattle against their saucers. He planted his palm on the table with a flat smack that made the silverware jump. "Are you really going to do this?" he demanded. "Are you really going to make us look like fools?" I looked at his hand, then back at his face. I did not match his volume. I did not mirror his energy. I said calmly, "You made your choices. Now I am making mine." Margaret dabbed at her tears and glanced at my aunt as if seeking an audience. "Tell her," she whispered. "Tell her this is not how a daughter behaves." My aunt hesitated, eyes moving from the paper to me to Margaret's trembling hands. The hesitation was the first crack in the story my parents were trying to build. Robert saw it and shifted tactics. He leaned forward, voice low, controlled. "You owe us respect," he said. "You owe this family stability. We kept this house together." I felt my jaw tighten, but my hand stayed steady on the edge of the counter. "Respect is not something you collect like rent," I said. "And this is not a debate." Daniel snorted and looked toward the living room as if measuring who else might be listening. He lowered his voice but made it sharper. "You are going to regret this, Anna. People are going to hear about this." Margaret nodded quickly, wiping her cheeks already transitioning from tears to threat. "People talk," she said softly, "especially about single mothers who cannot keep their families together." The words were meant to land like a brand. I let them hang in the air without answering. Then I added the one sentence I knew would matter later. "The dinner was recorded," I said. "The camera caught more than you think." Robert's eyes flicked for a split second toward the corner of the living room. Daniel's smile tightened. Margaret's lips parted, then closed again. My aunt looked startled, as if she had suddenly realized the story had documentation. I continued, still calm. There were witnesses that night, too. 20 people heard what was said to Lucy. My aunt's face shifted, and for the first time since she walked in, she did not look at Margaret with pure sympathy. Robert sat back again, expression hardening into something colder. "You are trying to punish us," he said. I shook my head once. "This is consequences," I said, and I watched Daniel's knee bounce under the table like he was trying to contain anger. The conversation did not end neatly. Margaret sobbed louder when my uncle arrived, telling him through gasps that I was throwing them out with nowhere to go. Robert paced the kitchen for a few minutes, muttering that I could not do this legally, that family law would protect them, that I would be sorry when a judge heard how I treated my elders. Daniel hovered near the doorway, whispering into his phone, already planting seeds. I let them talk. I did not take the bait. When the kitchen finally emptied, I went to the router and changed the Wi-Fi password again. I logged into the utility accounts that afternoon and confirmed every service was in my name, then scheduled changes that would happen after the 60-day mark transfers and shut-off options if I needed them. Ordinary steps, practical steps, the kind that made it harder for anyone to pretend I was bluffing. That evening, I found the first new messages on my phone cousins I had not spoken to in years, asking if everything was okay, if my parents were safe, if I had really lost my mind. The smear had already begun sliding into place like clockwork. The smear did not arrive as one big explosion. It seeped in message by message, post by post, like cold water creeping under a door. 2 days after I served the notice, Margaret created a private group on Facebook with a name that sounded innocent enough to pass as virtue: Prayers for the Warren Family. She added relatives, church friends, neighbors, and people I barely recognized from old holiday photos. The first post was a picture of her hands wrapped around a mug, the camera angled to make her look smaller and frailer than she was. The caption talked about heartbreak and betrayal, about elderly parents facing uncertainty, about children forgetting what honor meant. Comments poured in fast. People typed prayer hands and scripture verses. They asked for updates. They offered couches and spare rooms not because they knew the facts, but because Margaret had given them a story that made them feel righteous. Robert contributed in his own way by walking a careful line. He posted nothing, but he called people. He spoke in that calm, disappointed voice and let them fill in the blanks. Daniel was the accelerant. He dropped in the group with jokes and little jabs, calling me ungrateful, calling me emotional, suggesting I had always been unstable. He did it with laughing emojis, as if cruelty became harmless when you smiled while delivering it. Then the escalation turned personal. Margaret started tagging accounts. She tagged people connected to Lucy neighbors who had waved at us in summer, a woman from Lucy's school who ran the parent volunteer list, even someone I had met once at a school event. She wrote that she worried about Lucy being isolated, that the child needed a stable environment, that she feared my choices were hurting her. The implication sat right under the words like a shadow. If the group could not pressure me through shame, it would pressure me through my child. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a notification from a local parent group. Someone had posted a warning about a mother who was making her elderly parents homeless in winter. The wording was vague, but it was clear enough to point at me. People asked for details. Others offered judgment freely. A few defended me, saying there were always two sides, but their voices were drowned out by the certainty of strangers who had been handed a narrative. I could feel the net tightening around my life, each tag and comment pulling another thread. The worst part was how ordinary it looked from the outside. It was just social media, just concerned community chatter, just prayer requests. But inside my chest, it felt like a hand, squeezing steady and relentless. At work, I tried to keep my face neutral during meetings, but I could feel my concentration slipping. I work in a role where details matter, where mistakes can cost time and trust, and I could not afford to become the office distraction. The first time my manager asked if everything was all right, his voice careful, my stomach dropped. He did not accuse me. He did not gossip. He simply said he had seen something online and wanted to make sure it would not affect deadlines. The fact that it had reached him at all told me how far the smear had traveled. I gave him a short version: family dispute, housing situation, legal process. I kept it clean and factual, the way I had learned to keep everything. He nodded, but his eyes stayed cautious, and I could hear the unspoken question behind his politeness. Will this blow up here? That night, I sat at the kitchen table after Lucy went to bed and scrolled through the posts only once, to understand what I was up against. The comments were a mix of sympathy for Margaret and anger at an unnamed villain. Some called me heartless, some called me selfish, some said single mothers were always trouble. Daniel liked those comments and replied with phrases that made it sound like he knew more than he was saying. Margaret posted again, this time a photo of Robert staring out the window with his shoulders hunched as if he carried the weight of the world. She wrote about how he had worked his whole life and did not deserve this stress at his age. None of it mentioned that the mortgage was mine or that their temporary stay had turned into a decade of entitlement. None of it mentioned the dinner, the grip under the tablecloth, the way Lucy had frozen. I did not defend myself online. I documented it. That became my rule. I took screenshots. I saved URLs. I noted dates and times in my notebook. I printed the worst posts and slid them into a folder I labeled in plain black ink. Defamation and dates. I did not call it revenge. I called it evidence. Every time my phone buzzed with another message from a cousin asking if I really planned to let my parents sleep in their car, I answered politely and briefly, then saved the screenshot. Every time someone sent me a sermon about honoring parents, I thanked them and stopped replying. Silence was not weakness. Silence was space. At home, Margaret leaned into performance. She spoke louder on phone calls, making sure I could hear her say things like, "I do not know what happened to Anna. She is not herself lately." Robert stood in the driveway when neighbors walked by, sighing as if grief were a public service. Daniel made sure Lucy overheard comments about how sad it was when families broke apart. Lucy started asking if Grandma was sick. She started watching my face the way she used to watch Margaret's. That hurt more than any comment online. One evening, a message came from a cousin I trusted more than the others, someone who did not usually get involved. It was short, no emojis, no lecture, just a warning that made my skin go cold. "They are telling everyone you are unstable." I stared at the words for a long time, then set the phone face down. I added the message to the folder and closed it, because I could feel the next phase coming, and I needed to be ready. The public moment came on a Sunday afternoon at a church potluck in a low-ceiling community hall just outside Salem, the kind with folding tables and crockpots lined along the wall, a place built for casseroles and quiet judgment. My parents arrived early and took a central table as if it were their rightful seat. Margaret hugged people tightly and spoke in soft, worried tones. Robert stood with his hands folded, nodding gravely as neighbors approached. Daniel hovered close enough to be heard. By the time I walked in with Lucy holding my hand, the story was already moving through the room. Margaret began telling it to anyone who would listen, how she had sacrificed everything, how she feared for Lucy, how being raised by a single mother had created chaos she and Robert were trying to contain. Robert added his version in measured phrases, emphasizing respect and tradition, implying that I had lost my way. They spoke as if I were not standing there, as if my presence only proved their point. The escalation came when Margaret looked directly at me and said, "Maybe Anna should explain herself so everyone understands." Her smile tight and expectant. Heads turned. The room quieted in that way that feels heavier than noise. I felt Lucy's fingers curl into my palm. I stepped forward, not rushing, not apologizing. I set my folder on the table and opened it. I did not raise my voice. I began with dates. When I bought the house. When they moved in. I laid out copies of the lease agreement and the email confirming the terms. I placed printed bills on the table in neat stacks, mortgage statements, property tax notices, utilities, insurance. I showed the notice timeline with certified mail receipts. I let the paper do the talking. Then I said the sentence that changed the air. This is not a family argument. This is a tenancy situation. The words landed clean and final. A few people shifted in their chairs. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret's smile faltered as she tried to interrupt, but I continued, still calm. Everything I am saying is backed by paper. The room went silent. Not hostile, not supportive, just silent. One woman picked up a bill and read the name at the top. Another whispered something to her husband. Robert opened his mouth and closed it again. Margaret lost her rhythm and began talking faster, tripping over her own points. Then Daniel laughed sharp and careless and said the quiet part out loud. "She owes us. It is her job." The silence deepened. A few faces turned away from him. That was enough. If you believe boundaries matter even with parents, hit like. After the potluck, the tone shifted almost overnight panic, replacing confidence, in ways that were easy to miss if you were not looking for them. Margaret stopped posting inspirational quotes and started calling instead, her voice suddenly reasonable, asking if we could talk privately, just us, no paperwork, no audience. Robert followed with conditions framed as compromises, suggesting shorter timelines, shared responsibilities, anything that sounded like movement without surrender. Daniel tried a different angle, texting late at night with offers to smooth things over if I would reconsider, if I would keep things quiet, if I would think about the family image. They all circled the same idea from different directions. Negotiation without accountability, conditions without acknowledgement. I listened without committing. I took notes. When Margaret suggested staying until spring for health reasons, I asked her to put it in writing. When Robert proposed covering some expenses retroactively, I asked for dates and amounts. When Daniel talked about saving face, I reminded him that the timeline was already set. The more they realized I was not bending, the more frantic their tactics became. Mail began going missing. Certified envelopes I knew had arrived were nowhere to be found. Important documents disappeared from the kitchen counter and reappeared days later in different places. Margaret insisted she had never seen them. Robert suggested I was disorganized. Daniel joked that stress made people forgetful. Then the threats escalated. Margaret mentioned that outsiders worried about Lucy, that people might call in concerns if they felt a child was being isolated from grandparents. Robert hinted that a welfare check could be stressful for a single mother who worked long hours. Daniel sent a message asking if I was prepared for strangers asking questions about my home. None of them said the words directly. They did not have to. I felt the chill anyway. What they did not know was that I had anticipated this turn. The notice had gone out by certified mail and been logged. A process server had already been scheduled to ensure delivery was documented beyond dispute. I had timelines written out and taped inside my planner, each step checked off as it happened. When a letter went missing, I printed the delivery confirmation and added it to the folder. When a threat was implied, I logged the date and the phrasing. I did not react outwardly. I let the system do what systems do when fed clear information. At work, my focus sharpened. The anxiety that had once scattered my thoughts narrowed into precision. I kept my performance steady because I understood that stability was part of protection. At home, I reduced points of friction. I stored important papers in a locked drawer. I moved Lucy's routines to parts of the house less accessible to commentary. I spoke less and listened more. When Margaret asked why I was being so cold, I said I was following the process. When Robert accused me of turning this into a legal battle, I reminded him that he had raised me to respect rules. The first official notice from the court arrived quietly, a confirmation that the filing had been received and logged. I did not announce it. I placed it in the folder and updated my checklist. The second notice followed with a tentative hearing window. That was when the calls intensified. Margaret cried again, this time without witnesses, begging for time, for mercy, for understanding. Robert appealed to reason, arguing that judges favored families, that nothing good came from escalation. Daniel oscillated between anger and bargaining, promising cooperation 1 hour and warning me the next. I stayed consistent. The system moves slowly until it does not, and I could feel the shift building. I contacted a property manager recommended by a colleague and discussed turnover procedures without drama. We talked about locksmith timing, cleaning crews, inventory checklists, the mundane details that turn endings into transitions. I scheduled estimates, I lined up dates. Each appointment felt like placing another brick in a wall they could not climb. When Margaret accused me of planning behind their backs, I told her the truth. The preparation was not betrayal. It was responsibility. The hearing date was set and confirmed. I read the notice once, then again, letting the finality sink in. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and updated my ledger. Every step accounted for every document in place. Upstairs, Lucy slept through the night without asking if she was bad. Downstairs, the house felt taut, as if it knew something decisive was coming. The night Margaret knocked on my bedroom door, it was after midnight. The house quiet in a way that makes every sound feel louder than it is. I had just finished checking Lucy and pulling the door mostly closed When I heard the soft tapping, careful and rehearsed, followed by her voice kept low, as if volume alone could make a request reasonable. "Anna," she whispered for Lucy's sake. I did not open the door right away. I stood there with my hand on the knob, breathing evenly, letting the moment settle. When I opened it a few inches, Margaret was there in a robe, hair pulled back, eyes red, in a way that could have been tears or could have been effort. She started speaking immediately. Words stacked too fast, saying this had gone too far, saying children needed grandparents, saying Lucy would remember who tried to keep family together. I listened without interrupting. I did not invite her in. I said one sentence and then waited. "This is not a late-night conversation," I said. She flinched as if the boundary surprised her. The next morning, Robert tried his turn at the kitchen table while Lucy ate cereal. He waited until Lucy left the room and then leaned forward, palms flat, voice earnest. "Winter is hard," he said. "Just a few more months. Until spring." He framed it as practical, as humane, as if time itself could erase what had already happened. I looked at him and answered with fewer words than he expected. "The timeline is set," I said. He pressed again, talking about weather, about health, about how judges looked at circumstances. I shook my head once. He sighed and said, "He never thought I would be this cold." I did not correct him. The escalation came later that week when Margaret approached Lucy in the living room while I was in the kitchen. I heard the shift in her tone before I saw it. The sweetness turned syrupy. "Tell your mom you want Grandma," she said, crouching to Lucy's level. "Tell her you miss me." Lucy froze the way she had frozen at the table weeks ago, eyes flicking toward me. I stepped into the doorway and spoke calmly. "Do not do that," I said. Margaret stood up slowly, hands raised as if I had accused her of something unreasonable. "I am just talking to my granddaughter," she said. I kept my voice level. "You are trying to use her." "Stop." Lucy came to my side and pressed her face into my hip. I felt her breathing change, shallow and fast. I put my hand on her back and addressed my parents without raising my voice. "You had years to treat her gently," I said. "You chose control over love." The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Robert looked away. Margaret opened her mouth and then closed it again. The house felt smaller after that, every room edged with tension. That evening, Daniel cornered me by the garage with a different proposition, one he clearly thought was clever. He spoke quickly, glancing around as if secrecy added value. "We can make this go away," he said. "We will leave quietly. No posts, no calls, no drama. You drop the paperwork and we will keep our mouths shut." I watched him talk, watched the confidence flicker when I did not respond immediately. He kept going, offering silence as if it were a gift, as if accountability were optional. I waited until he finished. "Too late," I said. His smile collapsed into irritation. He asked what I meant. I answered with the smallest reveal I had allowed myself so far. "Paperwork is already in motion," I said. "I have already recorded the judgment." The words changed the air between us. He stared at me as if recalculating, then scoffed and said I was bluffing. I did not argue. I turned back toward the house. Behind me, I heard him mutter that I was heartless. Inside, Lucy was building a puzzle on the floor, humming softly to herself. I sat down beside her and helped fit a piece into place. Upstairs, Margaret cried again behind a closed door. Downstairs, Robert paced and sighed. The audacity of their return had spent itself, and the quiet that followed was not peace, but inevitability. The day the door finally opened to quiet was the kind of Oregon morning that felt gray all the way through, cold rain falling in steady sheets that turned the driveway into shallow ripples and made the air smell like wet cedar. I woke before dawn and listened to the house, to the familiar creaks and the hum of the heater, and then to the absence of any conversation downstairs. Lucy slept in her pajamas with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I dressed her slowly, spoke softly, kept her close because I wanted her to feel steadiness even if the world outside the windows looked like it was dissolving into rain. By 8 o'clock, the deputy arrived, not rushing, not dramatic, just a uniform and a clipboard under a rain slicker boot splashing lightly as he walked up the path. He introduced himself, checked the address, verified the paperwork, and asked me to confirm that the occupants were inside. His tone stayed professional. He was not here to punish anyone. He was here to ensure a process was followed. I handed him the documents from my folder and watched him read the names and dates, his pen moving in small, precise motions. He asked if I expected problems. I told him they had already used every tactic they could. He nodded once and took his position near his vehicle, visible enough to keep the day from turning into something worse. Across the street, curtains moved. A neighbor walked out with a trash bin and then paused too long. Another car slowed as it passed, windshield wipers working hard, the driver looking over with that mix of curiosity and discomfort small towns do so well. Margaret emerged first, wrapped in a coat that looked too thin for the weather hairpin back face arranged into sorrow. She carried a plastic storage bin and moved slowly as if every step was a burden she deserved sympathy for. Robert followed with 2 suitcases, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the wet ground. Daniel came next, jaw tight, hauling a box with quick, angry movements that made water splash up his jeans. He looked at me and then at the deputy, and then back at me like he was trying to decide who to blame. Margaret paused near the porch and turned her face toward the neighbors, as if making sure her sadness was witnessed. She dabbed at her eyes and whispered something about how she never thought this would happen. The deputy remained still, hands loosely at his sides, watching, not interfering unless needed. Daniel tried to make it a fight with words because words were his weapon. He dropped a box harder than necessary, then turned toward me and raised his voice over the rain. "You satisfied now?" he called. "You finally got what you wanted." He laughed sharply like he expected the sound to pull people to his side. Margaret followed his lead with performance shoulders shaking as she cried louder when a neighbor stepped closer under an umbrella. She said things like, "We have nowhere to go and I hope you can live with yourself." Robert did not shout. He stood silent, which somehow felt like another accusation. I kept Lucy beside me on the porch, her small hand in mine, her body tucked against my leg under a blanket. I did not let her stand alone in the open. I did not let her become a prop. When Daniel demanded an answer, I gave him one line, calm and steady, not for him, but for Lucy and for myself. "It was not revenge," I said. "It was consequences." The sentence cut through the noise more than yelling ever could. Daniel stared as if he had expected me to apologize. Margaret's crying hitched for a moment, her face shifting like she had lost the script. The deputy glanced at me briefly, then back to the driveway, continuing to monitor. The rain kept falling. Boxes stacked under the garage overhang bins lined up like an inventory of a life that had assumed permanence. Daniel kept talking, muttering about lawsuits, about how family would never forgive me, about how people in town would remember. Margaret kept wiping her cheeks, looking around for sympathetic eyes. Robert lifted a suitcase into the trunk of their car without looking at me. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I breathed slowly and kept my hand on Lucy's shoulder when she leaned into me. When the last bag was loaded and the car doors began to shut, Lucy tugged at my sleeve and looked up with wide, honest eyes. "Mommy," she asked softly, "why is Grandma crying in the rain?" The question landed in my chest like a weight, because it held no anger, only confusion and concern. My throat tightened. I knelt so I was level with her, shielding her from the wind with my body. "Because sometimes grown-ups make choices that make saying goodbye hard," I said. I did not tell her that Grandma was crying because control had finally met a boundary. I did not tell her that tears could be tools. I let Lucy keep her innocence a little longer. The car backed out fast, tires spinning on wet gravel, and disappeared down the street. The deputy waited until the taillights were gone, then nodded once, asked if I needed anything else, and left with the same calm he arrived with. The neighborhood slowly returned to pretending nothing had happened. Curtains closed. The trash bin rolled back toward a garage. The rain kept tapping at everything. Inside the house, the silence was deafening. No television blaring, no footsteps upstairs that were not Lucy's, no sighs or muttered comments from the kitchen. Just the steady sound of rain on the roof, and Lucy's small breathing beside me. I locked the door. Then I did what I had planned to do. The practical steps that turn an ending into a clean record. I walked through each room with my phone and took photos of the condition of the house walls, floors, counters, doors, anything that could be disputed later. I checked inventory against my list, noting what they left behind: a lamp in the corner, a box of old papers, a pair of boots by the back door. I labeled everything with dates. I documented the state of the property like a professional because that is what protected us now, not feelings. When I finished, I set the phone down and stood in the living room for a moment listening to the emptiness. Lucy took one cautious step, then another, as if testing whether she was allowed to be free in her own home. I took her hand and led her toward the kitchen. The day was not over. The next part was just beginning. The quiet that followed had weight to it, not empty, but present like a sound you notice only after it has been missing for years. I started cleaning without rushing, moving room to room with a trash bag and a small box, peeling away the traces of control that had accumulated quietly. Notes came off the refrigerator, first reminders written in Margaret's careful hand about milk and manners and gratitude, each one lifted and folded and dropped into the bag. The television remote went next. The preset religious channel cleared, so the screen no longer woke the house with sermons meant to shame. I set the thermostat to a temperature that made sense for Lucy, and left it there. No more silent wars over degrees and comfort. The kitchen felt larger with the table cleared properly, chairs pushed in, no one claiming the head by habit. I opened windows, even though it was cold, because fresh air mattered more than perfect warmth. Lucy watched me at first, as if unsure whether this freedom would last. Then she began to move faster, lighter. She ran from the living room to the hallway and back again, her footsteps echoing in a way they never had before, a hollow, joyful sound that made her laugh out loud. She spun once in the middle of the room and asked if she was allowed to play tag inside. I said yes. The word felt simple and enormous at the same time. That afternoon, the mail arrived with a plain envelope that carried more relief than celebration. The first payment from the plan we had set in motion, a return of money that should never have been assumed as theirs. I deposited it quietly and used it exactly as I had planned, to pay down the home equity line I had opened years ago to keep lights on and heat running for everyone under this roof. Watching the balance drop to zero did not feel like winning. It felt like releasing a breath I had been holding too long. Numbers are honest when people are not. I cooked dinner that night without commentary hovering in the air, just the sounds of chopping and a pan warming. Lucy sat at the counter and told me a story about a dog she wanted to draw, next her voice steady, no pauses to check my face for approval. After she went to bed, I walked through the house again, not to document this time, but to notice. The walls looked the same, but the pressure was gone. The silence did not judge. It simply existed. Over the next few days, I started small repairs with a clear budget written on paper and taped inside a cabinet. A loose hinge tightened, a chipped door frame sanded smooth. Nothing flashy, nothing symbolic beyond function. I scheduled estimates for paint where scuffs told old stories and chose neutral colors that felt calm rather than impressive. I tracked expenses in the same notebook that had logged the harm, because healing deserves structure too. Lucy helped where she could, handing me screws, asking questions, laughing when the screwdriver slipped. Midweek, my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin who had stayed quiet through the worst of it. She wrote carefully, not accusatory, just informative, saying my parents were struggling to secure a place, the debts had surfaced, that the story was no longer as clean as it had been made to seem. She did not ask me to fix it. She simply told me, because news travels whether you invite it or not. I read the message once and set the phone down. The information did not pull me backward. It confirmed what boundaries do when enforced. That evening, Lucy raced across the living room again, counting her steps, delighted by the echo. I sat on the couch and listened, letting the sound fill the space. The quiet had become something else now, not absence, but room. Spring 2025 arrived, the way Oregon spring always does, not all at once, but gradually rain, easing into softer mornings, and sunlight showing up like it had finally remembered where we lived. Cherry blossoms opened along the street, and Lucy stopped flinching when chairs moved. Inside the house, the changes were simple but unmistakable. I replaced the heavy curtains my mother had insisted on with light linen panels that let the day in. I painted scuffed walls a calm, clean shade that made the rooms feel larger without trying to impress anyone. The kitchen became orderly again, counters clear cabinets labeled for my own convenience, not as rules meant to control. I fixed what needed fixing and left the rest alone. I did not try to erase the past with a fantasy makeover. I just made the space honest. With the house steadier and my finances finally breathing, I made a decision that was practical, not romantic. I posted one spare room for rent through a reputable local site, fully legal background checks, clear terms, quiet house, single mom and child, respectful environment only. I screened carefully checked references, verified income, and trusted my instincts when someone felt off. Eventually, I chose a roommate who fit the life we were building, a calm woman who worked long shifts at a nearby clinic and valued peace as much as we did. She moved in with 2 suitcases and a small box of books, thanked me for the straightforward agreement, and paid her rent on time without needing reminders. It was not a fairy tale, it was stability. Lucy warmed up slowly, then one day asked if our roommate liked pancakes. When our roommate laughed and said yes, Lucy ran to me like she had just solved something important. The house filled with a different kind of sound. After that, not forced holiday cheer, just ordinary life doors opening without tension. Footsteps that did not carry threat. The wow part of the ending was not that money fell from the sky or that someone powerful swooped in. The truth was quieter and stronger. Long before the potluck and the paperwork, I had built a plan. I had formed a small LLC for a side consulting stream. I managed on evenings and weekends the kind of work that did not make headlines, but paid reliably when handled with discipline. I kept it separate. I tracked everything. I paid taxes on it. I never bragged about it because people in my family treated good news like a resource to claim. That LLC was why I could set aside money for exactly the moment when I would need to move without fear. It was why I could keep legal steps clean and measured. It was why Lucy always had what she needed, even when the house felt heavy. I also had a financial plan for her long before anyone tried to use her as leverage. A college account, an emergency cushion, a simple budget that treated our future like something real instead of something I hoped would happen. I was not lucky. I was consistent. I was tired, and I kept going anyway. News about my parents came through the same distant channels as before, a cousin, mentioning they had moved into a small apartment farther out, that the debts and the rent requirements had been harder than they expected, that the story they told online had not helped them when paperwork was asked for. Daniel, I heard, had stopped posting entirely. Once people began asking practical questions he could not spin. I did not celebrate it. I did not reach out. They made choices and the system followed. That was all. One evening near the end of spring, Lucy and I hung lights on the porch again, not because we needed a holiday to feel whole, but because we liked how they looked. The air smelled like damp earth and new leaves. Inside the house, the windows were open, and the curtains moved gently with the breeze. Our roommate was at the table filling out paperwork for work, humming softly. Lucy climbed onto a step stool and carefully clipped a strand of lights along the railing tongue, poking out in concentration. I watched her and felt something settle into place. The greatest change was not the house. It was the way Lucy moved through it, shoulders loose, laughter easy, no longer scanning faces for danger. When she finished the last clip, she hopped down and threw her arms around my waist. "This is the best home, Mommy," she said. I kissed the top of her head and held her a moment longer than necessary. If you are in something like this, you are not wrong for choosing peace. What would you have done?